Nau mai, haere mai, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Alan Ovens, and I'm the Director of the Richard Tinning Research Unit at the University of Auckland. And it is our great pleasure to be able to host this webinar on physical literacy, physical education, and to begin a critical conversation around the topic. I'm so thrilled that we've been able to put together a panel to be able to begin this conversation. And I have to stress, it is a bit of a beginning of a conversation. We're not sort of closing it off at this point. And it is one that we feel that we want to be able to continue. So if I can, let me see, begin my, put on my little PowerPoint here, and hopefully that's coming through. So that's how, the aim of today is to be able to begin this conversation. Why can I move that forward? Here we go. Begin a conversation around physical literacy and its relation to physical education as a curriculum practice in schools. The idea here is to reflect on how school curriculum and pedagogy may evolve or absorb or be shaped by the concept of physical literacy. And I suppose I have to stress that when our aim here is not to relitigate what physical literacy is, or to explore and redefine the concept. And it's not that that doesn't need to happen, and we would really advocate that we need more discussion around the actual concept of what physical literacy is. But that's not our aim here today. And our aim really is to think about the relationship between physical literacy as this global discourse, which has at its core a real concern for the physical activity and the educational outcomes of movement education, which seems to overlap with heavily with the physical education. And so we're looking at how these two things may intersect and interrupt each other. The purpose was also to be able to support the special edition. So the special edition of the curriculum studies in health and physical education is a journal that initially started off as a regional journal coming out of Australia. It used to be the Asia Pacific Journal of Sport, Health and Physical Education. And it has now evolved into curriculum studies in health and physical education. As a journal, it's really focused on and being able to aim at that space, which is being able to bring a critical lens to critical studies in health and physical education. And so this special edition is adding to that particular space. The way that the webinar will work today is, once I start talking, a little bit of an introduction here, I'm going to ask each of the lead authors of the papers in the special edition to summarize their papers. Then hopefully there is enough issues coming out of those papers to create a bit of a discussion. And then we'll also be able to take some audience questions in that and be able to squeeze that all within an hour. Now, I know there's a huge interest in the webinar, and we're absolutely thrilled about that. So to be able to support the potential for discussion around this, we have a Padlet up, and if I can briefly stop sharing my screen there and move to just have a quick look at the Padlet that we've got up there. You'll see the link to the Padlet in the chat function there, and the Padlet has a number of different columns, and you can add a point to the Padlet and just put a comment in there or respond to one of the provocation questions, and that'll enable the discussion to be able to happen at the same time that we're talking about some of the papers. So that's that function, and if you want to link into that and have a look at that, we would love to know who's online, what sparked your interest in the webinar, and some of the response to that. If you want to also ask some questions, the we're not using the chat function. I would go to the Q&A function. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A. So rely on the Q&A. But just knowing at the moment that we need, some people are asking for the Padlet link, I will put that in the chat function now. So you'll see a link to the Padlet, and you can go visit there. All right, so let's go back to this. Oops. Back to my. Okay, so it's now my great pleasure to be able to introduce our wonderful panelists. As the editors of the special edition, I'm going to start just by framing up the special edition a little wee bit and talk about the paper that Emma Enright and I wrote, which is called Infection or Affection, Physical Literacy and the Reterritorialization of the HP curriculum. Then I'll hand off to Dylan Landy, who has recently shifted from the US to Scotland. But Dylan is focused on Shape America and how physical literacy has been handled within their policy documents. Then we'll come back into the Southern Hemisphere. Susie Stevens from the University of Canterbury will talk about a project that we did with Sport New Zealand on developing a physical literacy tracking tool. Then we'll move to Suzanne Lundvall from the University of Gothenburg, who's going to look at physical literacy in the Swedish context. Coming back down to Justin O'Connor, who's kindly stepped in at the last minute for Lisa Young, who's been called away, and looking at their paper around assessing physical literacy in health and PE. And then to wind us up at the very end, in every connotation that might be, is Trent Brown, who is going to look at physical literacy within the Australian physical education curriculum area. And so that's what we're looking at. Hopefully we'll give a brief summary of each one of those papers and then move on. So let me begin by first of all framing up what we wanted in the special edition. And as I said, we wanted to bring some way of thinking about physical literacy and curriculum and what happens when those two things intersect with each other, and how do they affect each other? What sort of influence do they have? Our idea here was somehow to not focus in on what something is. Okay, so what physical literacy is or what physical education is. We think there's a huge amount of work that is done around defining things, but rather focus attention to what something does. So it's a very subtle but important shift. In order to do that, we needed to move our lens away from, say, conventional studies or thinking about curriculum as a document or a policy that had some sort of content to it, to think of it more as in a fluid way. And so by thinking of curriculum as a fluid type of concept that responded to its environment was the framework that we wanted to work with. The tool that we used coming out of Gilles Deleuze's work was the notion of an assemblage. It's quite a difficult concept to work with. It's the notion of being able to think of these things as compositions of things that come together in order to produce things. And so that's quite a useful metaphor for thinking about physical education. So what's the assemblage of things that come together in a composition that are assembled in a particular way in order to produce this thing called a physically educated citizen or an educated citizen, or this thing, the subject area called physical education. And so that was the tool that we were able to use. And of course, thinking about in terms of assemblage, we're able to think about certain questions. So if physical education is assemblage, then physical literacy is also an assemblage. And so then the question, a critical question comes, how does physical literacy normalize HPE as part of a broader rubric of thinking about community health and sport outcomes? And does it do that? And thus possibly reduce ways of thinking about HPE in different ways? Okay, so in what way does it shift the field and maybe constrain the field in particular ways? One of the important things about what an assemblage does is it chisels out or creates a territory for itself. It's a process of territorialization. So that became another theoretical tool for us to use, this notion of territorialization. And of course, as we said before, if curriculum is fluid, then this notion of territory is also fluid. So the process of territories are always being created, and you have a process of deterritorialization and reterritorialization as different flows of desire and affect come into the field. So if we're thinking of physical literacy as an assemblage, then how does this enable different policy actors to have a voice within the curriculum field? How does it normalize particular values, and how this may enhance or constrain our notion of quality physical education? So that's the notion of deterritorializing and reterritorializing the field in the name of physical literacy. The last thing there that our paper looks at there is to say, well, this is not just two particular flows of sort of ideas in there. HPE is just the most amazingly vibrant field. So once you look into the field, there are multiple flows of multiple ideas, multiple discourses in there, everything from social justice, models-based practice. There's a lot of people advocating and pushing for different ideas. And so there's a vibrancy to that, an energy where different people are advocating for what physical education should look like in a school. And so that really does raise the question, is physical literacy, does it sit alongside these? Is it another concept? Is it that we're just going to sit alongside these, or does it sit above these, or what? Anyway, so that's a little bit about our paper. I will now pass off to Dylan as our next speaker. And I don't see him on our screen. It's Dylan disappeared. I think he has. All right, well, we'll move on to Susie, and then we can pick up Dylan if he manages to connect. Being from up in Scotland, the most probably fairly early in the morning.
That's fabulous. I will share my screen with you now. Hang on a minute. Okay, is that working there okay, and everyone can hear me? Beautiful. Nō ko te rana o ku te puna, nō o tautahi ahau, ko tēnei taku mihi ki ngā mana whenua o te rohe nei. Ko Susanna Stevens tōku ingoa. I'm Susanna Stevens, or Susie. Susanna's kind of if I'm naughty, and I might be a bit naughty right now with what I'm going to present. But I just said that I'm from Christchurch, New Zealand. And that I'm Scottish. So a big shout out to Dylan, who has now just joined us. And I'm sorry, Dylan, but I've taken your spot. So I'm continuing. You are up next, and you've really got nothing to say about that. I'm presenting today on the behalf of a wonderful writers team. Myself, Alan Ovens, Jeremy Hapeta, and Kirsten Petrie. And just shout out to the whole team with the note that all of them would have contributed in beautiful ways. And I'm sorry, but you've landed with me. Very quickly, we tried to cover a lot in this paper, and I want to go through the foundations of the paper and where it came out of. In New Zealand, we have the government agency Sport New Zealand, and we are very lucky that Sport New Zealand are open and willing to have discussions to this effect. Where education sits in New Zealand is quite convoluted, because at times physical education ends up in Sport New Zealand's guard, but we often think that it should be closer aligned to the Ministry of Education, and sometimes this creates a little bit of contention to where this sits. But essentially what the process was, or what they are trying to do, is trouble if a physical literacy tracking tool could be something that could be user-friendly, could be something that could help support people's physical literacy in New Zealand. Now, just a disclaimer here, that this is a really broad and really early entry-level sort of stages. This is not something that has been developed or has been put into schools. But what this paper was doing was troubling and was providing a critical lens to that, to inform Sport New Zealand to make educated decisions. So we started having some advisory discussions around what are the links here to the New Zealand curriculum, how could this tool be used, or if there was uptake from teachers, what would that look like, what would the key threats be. So we had an idea to do a document analysis alongside a Māori variation of a thematic analysis. So we were very bicultural in our methodologies, where we mapped the proposed physical literacy tracking tool elements against the health and physical education curriculum. And what we really came across, what we stumbled across, is our key findings were that the proposed physical literacy tracking tool as is, through no fault of its own, but in design, there is a focus on the physical. And what we mean by that is we mean that the physicality and the performativity is a really important part in what that's trying to assess. There's a development of self, so the self is in control. The human themselves has their own responsibility of their health and their physicality, and we question that, is that a return to individualism? And there's an overemphasis within the ideas of a physical literacy tracking tool around the learning in movement, so the doing of movement, but we connect that and trouble that with celebrating a paradigm of individual performance. The reasons we trouble these things is because the curriculum in New Zealand is really different. Since '99 has really struggled and fought fervently to try and move people's thinking to a more diverse and critical way of understanding that is founded in biculturalism. So our curriculum is founded upon 4 underlying concepts, one of which is based on Te Whare Tapawha, which is a model of health by Mason Jury. And there is a real focus on the bicultural, the whole mover. The other key aspects there is that the idea of the development of self is not in isolation of whānau, or family, or the society in which we live. And there's an emphasis there on the socio-ecological perception. And there's a balance in our New Zealand curriculum of the learning in movement, being in movement, but learning through and about movement in a bicultural way and celebrating all 3 equally. Long story short, and this is probably the most succinct I've ever been in my life, but I am very cognizant of time, and I do want the discussion to happen at the end of the session. And so the outcome for us writing this paper, we were troubled in our thinking, because we see the benefits, we see what something like this could bring, but we see a huge amount of risk for the narrowing of curriculum and colonisation that would go with that, from adopting a tool that may not be right for a bicultural curriculum. And I guess it was our purpose to provoke conversation, to critically analyse what current literature was out there and what the discussion topics were. And this is where this paper sits, and that's the intent of this paper. So look, I will wrap up there, and I'm really, really excited about what questions may come to the end and the further discussions that we can have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susie. It's great. So when you stop sharing your, yep, great. And we'll hand over to Dylan.
Hey, sorry about that. I'm in temporary accommodation, so everything here is just start and go as we go. So thanks for having us. My name's Dylan Landy. I'm currently at the University of Strathclyde, and my co-authors are Tara Blackshear and Carrie McFadden. Both are from Towson University, where I was when we wrote this paper. The real goal of this was to see how physical literacy is influencing curriculum in the United States and policy documents in particular. So just to give you a little background, the largest organization in the US is called Shape America, the Society of Health and Physical Educators. And in 2014, they explicitly adopted physical literacy as an organizing principle in their curriculum document or their national standards. But what we were finding throughout the literature is that some people in the US use physical literacy as a concept. And there are a few of them out there, actually, not just Whitehead's. For example, Gletty has one in Canada. And the thing about the concept is it packages curriculum, pedagogy, and theory together into sort of digestible formats for teachers. That's the goal of it, in the same range that pedagogical models do as well. So we focused on Whitehead's concept simply because that's the one that Shape America adopted. And the theory that was packaged into that was phenomenology. Alan taught me how to say that word, actually. If you ever have trouble with it, go to him. Monist approaches and existentialism. Others in the US, however, use physical literacy as sort of a term. And we say term because it's sort of like a constellation of outcomes that keep shifting and changing depending on who's using them. And it's sort of utopian, or as Kennerstedt et al. Said, phantasmatic or phantasmic. So to do this, we sort of focused on orientation. So seeing how things are orientated in the world and which direction they're taking. And for us, we found that the physical literacy concept had a focus on holistic understanding, specific around motivation, so affective domains, self-expression, self-identity, along with cognitive domains around understanding concepts and such. And there was an area around confidence and competence and movement. Whereas the Shape America standards, on the other hand, their orientation was very strongly, we just need to get kids to learn skill. And if we get kids to learn skill, all those other things are just going to magically happen. So that was sort of the main focus of it. So right away, we see a disorientation between the way that the concept itself is meant to be used and the way that Shape America has employed it. It's as if it lost all of its meat as a concept. But in order to take on different directions or orientations, we have to put things in the background. We have to say, okay, to cover this, we can't cover that. And there's choices that are made. So in the background for Shape America was the entire notion of embodiment from physical literacy. The whole notion that these concepts are interconnected. So as Shape America developed their outcomes, everything became extremely behaviorist, where the motor skills were completely separate from cognitive, which were completely separate from the few affective things that were covered. But other things that were bracketed or put into the background for both physical literacy and Shape America's documents for us were social issues. It was as if race and ethnicity and gender and sexuality and socioeconomic status didn't exist in this process of movement and human movement and in Shape's particular area health. So what we found really was that the Shape America document really just fit their own values and what they valued in physical education back into portions of physical literacy as a concept without actually embodying the entire concept as a whole. And this disorientated things and actually worked to preserve a lot of these social inequities because they were doing nothing to disorientate or disrupt. So what we found really is that physical literacy as a concept did not transform curriculum or policy in the States, but rather reinforced a lot of the things that were going on previously. And it's because the way that it was taken up and used, and social issues were bracketed in both physical literacy and Shape America, which makes us wonder, should a single concept even be used in any type of curriculum or policy document? So thank you.
Great, thanks, Dylan. Oh, really good.
Cheers.
Okay, so now we're moving on to, sorry, I've been looking at the Padlet. So who's next now? We've got Suzanne.
Thank you.
What time is it at the moment in Sweden?
At the moment, I would say good morning
Right.
to you. So nice to be here together with you. And as Alan said, I, together with Göran Jardin, has produced a paper that we look into how physical literacy in Swedish physical education and health sits, what's impossible in becoming and being physical literate or educated. We have chosen to have two more or less research questions in this purpose. And it's both about how to understand the influence and the constitution of physical literacy or not in the Swedish PE, but it's also about how can different conceptions of physical literacy enable or constrain socially just and more equitable physical activities and health outcomes. To be able to do that, we have, let me see, we have used Bernstein as a theoretical framework to give an overview over important shifts in the Swedish curricula over time. And those shifts, they are about curricular codes and modes of pedagogical practice, about regulating principles, what to be learned, and surrounding discourses, their framing and the communication within the curricular documents. So what we need to know as non-Swedes, perhaps, is that the Swedish school politics and policies over several decades have had a very strong promotion of a welfare state, the equal possibility for every child to get an equal education as a good start in life. So that's the kind of background. And what we can see over time is that there's a move from a weak classification of the subject with invisible pedagogies and non-gradable procedures, where the content has had relations across different themes of acquisition, to a more strongly framed subject, a strong classification with visible pedagogy, insulated content, and gradable performances. And in relation to the construct of physical literacy, we can see that this has been part but never mentioned as a concept or construct, but it has been as a part of an existent competence mode. But today we can see that it's more like part of a performance mode related to the physical, as Susie was also discussing, related to a versatile physical competence and discourses around health. And what we can see is that the affective and motivational aspects are lacking. Social issues, cooperation, parts of ethical issues, and leadership questions. So what about the second research question? Well, we all know that literacy often represents the empowering of people. According to Whitehead and others, it's about developing identities, social relations, and beliefs. But today we would see, looking at the Swedish curricula, that physical literacy is used as a construct with a very strong focus on oneself as a learner. And this raises questions around culturally embedded and embodied experiences in relation to physical literacy and the construction of meaning-making, inclusion, diversity, and equity. So coming to some of our conclusions through this overview is that we need a call for a multiple approach that Dylan also was mentioning to physical literacy, using perhaps physical literacies to support students' reflective approaches to their own mastery and the meaning of movements, and to become critical consumers of physical activity without the privileging and marginalizing of certain bodies and identities. We also need physical literacy to be located in a social critical perspective and delivered through social just pedagogies. It's about content and pedagogies as well, because we need to move beyond individualistic achievements of narrow objectives and measurements. And I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now pass off to Justin O'Connor, University of Melbourne, Monash University.
Thanks very much. So I'll just share my screen. All right, we got that one working all right. Just, how's that? Can we see that? Excellent. All right, so our topic was exploring physical literacy through assessment, and Lisa Young was going to give tonight's chat, but she's been unable to make. I'm sure she would have done a much better job than I will, but Laura Elfrey and Dawn Penny were also on the team, so it was a good fun paper to engage with. I guess we come at this because why assessment? Why do we look at assessment? Well, I think what assessment does is it strips out all the fluff. So if you want to cut to the chase and see what we really mean by a term and how it gets enacted and what it's really focused on, is we go to the assessment, right? Because what's assessed is what's valued. And you know, you could put many words in the front of a document as you want about how broad and expansive a concept is, but when you get down to what you assess, you start to really see what's important. And so by focusing on assessment, we think we kind of cut to the chase around what's at the heart of this thing, and then how might that then impose itself in particular settings or contexts like health and physical education. And I think what we've discovered is we're at a crossroads, and there's a kind of couple of ways we could go here, and there might be more than one road, but you know, we could be heading in one of two directions. I think Dylan's already flagged what one of those directions might be. So we used, again, Bernstein's classification frame. We liked Bernstein's ideas around weak and strong classification. So strong classification is about thinking about the distinction between what gets assessed and all other possibilities in this space. And so the extent to which things get compartmentalized or have boundaries built around them and how insular those boundaries are were of interest to us. So things like ages, did we define physical literacy by particular ages, or how do we tell the story of fitness or skill or technical attribute? So those things we were looking at to see if they were sitting in a more holistic kind of notion of physical literacy, or were they quite distinct, and could you pull one out and assess it independently of all other things and come to a conclusion? The second thing we're interested in is this idea of framing. And so framing is about communication. It's about who's the transmitter and who's the acquirer of this kind of information or knowledge, and who regulates the process. So who makes the decisions? So how much autonomy does the learner have in the process of being assessed? And so we undertook a fairly extensive lit review. We looked at papers from 1993 to 2019, 300 papers in all, and we scanned them for assessment. So went through and systematically looked at where assessment was mentioned. We looked at the papers that talked about assessment, that presented assessment, and anything else to do with assessment in physical literacy. We ended up identifying 6 kind of prominent physical literacy assessment tools, and we evaluated those using Bernstein's framework. And in the paper, there's a table that kind of gives you an overview of the kinds of things we explored. We found very strong classification and framing in a number of those measures, or a number of those assessments. So they're listed on the screen, but essentially what these assessment tools did is they took a broad idea of physical literacy and they turned them into something that was very highly structured, teacher-led, very sequenced, very fixed criteria, scores out of X, and they commonly sort of prioritized, as we've already discussed in a few of the other papers, this set of narrow physical proficiencies. I mean, I think one of the assessments, you know, you do a plank, you throw a ball, you run between some cones, and you can be deemed physically literate. So if you think about the broad idea of physical literacy, can get reduced down to 5 or 6 kind of key skills in one assessment task. And that's what the young people will take away as being physically literate, because that's what they were measured on in the name of physical literacy. And so those kind of assessments are, I guess, a signpost or a signal to us to think about what kind of, how would we want this in a health and physical education curriculum. The other things I think were interesting was there's a kind of defined age limit, so you can be deemed physically literate at a particular point, so you can get your physical literate certificate, I guess. And that's kind of a fixed endpoint, so there's a goal to be attained here. We did find examples of weaker classification and framing, not perfect, but I mean, what is? But these framings kind of allowed for much more flexibility and much more of the kind of intent behind what, if we think of Whitehead's more phenomenological understanding of physical literacy, what was the intent there was around that kind of embodied journey. So being able to go on and describe how I am growing and how that growth happens from a perspective of whatever task I'm engaged in at whatever time. And so these assessments were much more student kind of centered in a way. They didn't necessarily ignore the other, but they were focused on the journey. And so therefore they were non-linear. You could go up, you could go down, and you could never achieve the end state of being physically literate, whatever that is. And so they did enable greater opportunity for individual difference and were more holistic in their nature. And so, if we're thinking of, okay, what kind of physical literacy or how might physical literacy shape and disrupt in the HPE space, then we're starting to think about that kind of weaker framing and the weaker classification is enabling more possibilities. So enabling more young people to see themselves in the things they're being assessed on. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. And I'll hand over to Trent.
Just checking everyone can see the screen now. Brilliant, thanks, Alan. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the Bunurong people, traditional custodians of the land where I'm physically present, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today herein. Just like to say thank you also and acknowledge my co-author, Rachel Whittle, who's at the Victorian Curriculum Assessment Authority. And as Alan mentioned earlier, you can see in the top left-hand screen, when I wrote the paper with Rachel at ADGFA Victoria, the Professional Learning Association. I'm now at Deakin University here in Melbourne. Our topic looked more so at physical literacy from the perspective of what was actually going on in the curriculum, and in particular the context here in Victoria, within the Victorian curriculum of health and physical education. And we sort of proposed the idea around physical literacy sitting alongside 5 of the other Australian curriculum propositions, and adding physical literacy as a 6th potential proposition. So as other authors and others have mentioned today, clearly, our purpose in our paper wasn't to revisit the concept per se, but as Alan said, moving from, that shift of, the is to what it actually does in terms of how teachers in particular, and those people who are working with curriculum, in particular, in my original role as a professional learning coordinator and manager, and also as Rachel's role within the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority, about supporting teachers in coming to understand, the concept of physical literacy and what that actually looks like or actually means, in that way. So our interest was very much, followed around the notion about how it was that the concept was to be taken up by teachers, if at all, and in particular that was clearly around the notions of what is its intent if it exists in a curriculum document, to how it's actually enacted. And one of the things that I'll talk about a little bit later is the Victorian context in particular as one of the areas of interest for us to be able to actually acknowledge. I do also want to acknowledge that some of this work, or the work in the paper, you can see that Justin O'Connor, who's a panel member tonight, I know that Dawn, I think, is also online, around that area Our frame was around, educational policy sociology, drawing on some of those lenses, and in particular, some of the work about how HPE teachers are actors in the processes of being able to actually, discuss and engage with the concept herein. So in particular, our context, as I said, was particularly focused around the Victorian curriculum. And also, if we think about it, in recent years, over the last 2 years here in Australia, Sport Australia has produced sort of two guiding documents around the physical literacy framework and the physical literacy guide for schools. And that obviously plays into a role about how we actually think about, Connolly and Connolly's work around the notions of, formal curriculum policies and also implicit curriculum policies, and what areas or what ways do teachers gravitate towards, some of those areas in that way. And clearly, some of those other contexts that play out with teachers' work, come from research. And then, as I mentioned, also the Professional Learning Association. If we look at the physical literacy in the curriculum at the moment, the interesting fact for our perspective is that there is actually no current explicit reference to physical literacy in the Victorian curriculum of health and physical education. So what does that actually, or how does that actually play out when we're actually engaging with teachers, in doing, some of this work right now? What does that actually mean? And so we were playing in this, this interesting space about that there's no explicit reference to the concept, but yet we sort of accept in some ways, as you can see in sort of those dot points number 3 and 4, the teachers are actually already engaging with this term, whether or not it's in their daily work in terms of some of the curriculum documents. It might be outwardly focusing in terms of driving an agenda that parents and others see on school websites, that teachers are doing physical literacy work. But we also come to this acknowledging in a rather sort of pragmatic and practical way that we know that if we look at some of the aspects in a more instrumental way, as some of the other authors have talked about, is that HPE teachers are already doing physical literacy work. So what does that mean in terms of, as Alan and Emar talked about in terms of the assemblages, about what that actually plays out to? Is it actually any different from the physical education work that they're currently doing, or is it just a name, physical education by another name? And you can pick up in some of that other work. And then I just want to acknowledge that clearly, clearly that we framed this conversation around the work, and I thank Laura, because I know that she's online, hiding in the background there too, that a lot of her work around Alfred O'Connor and Jean's work around teachers as policy actors really come to the fore here, because they have to be the drivers of what's actually seen to be appropriate in that way. And we pick that up, in our paper. We sort of propose it as a proposition, and here in Australia, there are 5 propositions around educative outcomes, critical inquiry, health literacy, valuing movement, and there's always one that I forget and it'll come to me. But one of the other ways is that they're the overarching statements to inform the curriculum. And we felt necessary that part of this work is that from not only the work that we see in Whitehead, but some of the work that actually goes on in other areas could clearly fit as sitting alongside that policy work in the propositions. And hence we see that physical literacy has a role to play, irrespective of the perspective that one brings, because we feel that it is an overarching concept that can come from multiple different lenses. And as people know my work around multiple ways of knowing, it actually brings diversity to the table. But importantly, we know that physical literacy as a concept is both contemporary and futures focused. It does come from multiple different content and disciplinary bases, and therefore multiple different perspectives. And then also we think that it aligns with a 21st century curriculum. And those last 3 points are all points that in the shaping paper of the curriculum all point to the appropriateness of propositions being enacted in that way. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Trent. All right, great. So in that sort of wonderful summary, I knew it was going to go over time, even though I gave strict instructions to keep it brief. But I think what's wonderful about that is you get a sample of many of the issues that were raised in the special edition. And what I missed saying at the start was that, you know, there are some wonderful scholars in physical literacy globally, and a lot of work has already been done. In putting the special edition together, we didn't specifically hunt out people who were working in the area of physical literacy, but we wanted physical educators working in the curriculum area to give some thought to this. And so I think our panel brings together that level of expertise. Now, one of the questions I want to start, and actually I have to say that we've got over 100 people online, which is wonderful. So that is so good. And just looking through the Padlet there is just wonderful to see how many people, where everybody's coming from, and you know, what a wonderful medium that the net is, to be able to connect people and create this sort of this community of inquiry. But at the same time, with 100 people online, it's really hard to get a discussion going. So I've looked through some of those comments and questions in there, and I thought I would just sort of start by asking a few of the questions and see how far we can get. And one of those questions, my first question, is to pick up the notion of, if I can see it written here, is physical literacy something that is attractive to physical educators because it gives us a sense of legitimacy in the curriculum, in this wider school curriculum? Physical education is often pitched as something that's in crisis, and therefore are we struggling to maintain a position in school curriculum? And is this something that we're going to attach ourselves to because literacy is a concept that society values? Is there any comments in regards to that?
I don't think you're the first one to draw that link, Alan. I think you know, literacy is a bit of a buzzword, right? And it's not just in health and PE, it's kind of broader than that. There are a range of literacies that are kind of coming into the popular, I guess, global terminology. And so, yes, I think there is an element of trying to attach yourself to a concept that has kind of traction within particular, you know, performative neoliberal, you know, contexts like schools, and to see that you're a legitimate contributor to that overall goal. So yeah, I would say there's definitely a part of it, and it's difficult to pin that down. It's difficult to find that. Certainly been looking for it, but it's hard to tie it to any. No one comes out and says it.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think there is a longing for a concept that could include a kind of wholeness. And that's what actually PE teachers, they're working with the whole child, the whole student. And going through, I mean, a very individualistic era, we are perhaps looking for something else, or trying to grasp something that could actually pick up the overall curriculum that's more broader than what we later on assess. And that's a difficulty. So I think it's in a time of crisis, this concept or construct is attractive, but we need to ask questions behind what kind of mechanism is there behind, in whose interests, and that's why I guess social justice questions are very important.
I think the other thing as well, Alan, the interesting thing, you know, from another perspective, is that I know that both the New Zealand curriculum and parts thereof of the Australian curriculum are informed by sort of some of the, you know, notions of Peter Arnold's work, you know, in, through and about. You know, as Suzanne talked about, you know, the aspects of that work is clearly that there is a holism associated with that, but that doesn't seem to be present in the discussion that we've talked about at the moment with regard to physical literacy. And I wonder whether or not that there's a notion, you know, there that I think Dylan, you know, picked up in terms of using, you know, a phenomenological lens. I know that in the past that there's you know, been different, you know, aspects about meaning making, and you know, some of the panel members here talk about, that aspect of joy and delight. And that clearly fits with the Arnoldian dimension, but it links very much to what we call physical literacy, especially from a Whiteheadian, concept or a Whiteheadian perspective. And I think that we can't lose sight that that's actually happened before too.
Do you want to add anything, Susie or Dylan?
I guess my thing is, I don't believe that physical education should have one organizing principle that sort of dictates these things. I had a conversation with Rod Philpott once. We were in the hallway at the University of Auckland, and he gave a wonderful sort of metaphor. He said, I don't want the best sort of McDonald's where everybody is doing sort of similar things. I want the best Italian restaurant, the best Mexican restaurant, the best Japanese restaurant. And the purpose of that, or from my perspective, understanding that, is Rod's saying we want different forms of physical education and health education because we have different students, we have different contexts, we have different places, and we want to represent the best version of it in that particular context. The question for me is, how well can a single concept do that, right? And this is the question that's happening. And so I believe in, if we're going to use the Deleuzian, since we're on that track here, Alan, a rhizomatic, where new things pop up, creativity is it's celebrated, innovation and experimentation and trying new things, rather than fitting things back into concepts. We want concepts that break things open, not shut things down. And I'm not saying that physical literacy does or doesn't do that. I'm saying that's what I think we need to invest in conceptually.
Yeah, I thought that comment. I support that comment, Dylan. And again, I think that there's power involved when we make decisions about using a framework. And one of my troublings with writing this paper was who is in power making these decisions, and what does that look like? And we know that these decisions are made with curriculum, but they're often made over time with a long period of consultation. I know that New Zealand spent and grappled with their curriculum for a really long time to make sure that we were doing justice to a lot of different voices, and we weren't providing packets of knowledge. And an example of this is Rangamaria Te Turiki Rose Piri. And she was a New Zealand Māori educationalist, and she moved our thinking from te reo kore, which is the language of movement, to te ao kore, which is the world of movement, the language of movement to the world of movement. Now that knowledge it is so much deeper than a definition. And I think that what happens over time is we start to dilute these ideas of what conceptually they're on about. And that can happen through definition and redefinition over time. And I would just like to say that we need to be critical with power, why these exist. And as Susan says, who is making these choices? Yeah, so I agree. I tōtuku what you're saying, Dylan, about difference, about allowing difference, about having multiple perspectives.
Yeah, and I just would like to add that it really deals also with the pedagogies and the content. We need to take these questions all the way up and down and through different layers, because it's often like researchers, we stop at the definitions. But we need practice-based research also to see empirically how could we open up for enabling different practices and different bodies and allowing a broader spectrum.
And I think in the background there too is there is a battle over what the nature of teaching is. So as Dylan has said, are we talking about the McDonaldization of education, which is the standardization of having fairly uniform, universal type ideas, or are you talking about specialization? And that goes back to the notion of teaching. how do we re-professionalize teachers? How do we give them the capacity to make professional decisions that are in the interests of their kids? How do we give them the capacity to create programs that meet the needs of their kids in their particular area and are creative and are exciting and acknowledge their individual identity and their cultures and those sorts of things, which I think, you know, some of the critique that we've seen today is to go back to the people who are writing about physical literacy as a challenge to them. How do you create this diversity within a globalized framework which is, you know, people are promoting? How do you enable some individuality, and acknowledge the differences that are there? Especially from Indigenous people. How do we acknowledge Indigenous people's knowledge and ways of being in individual countries? How do you allow them to take some lead in this area? So one very quick round then, which is associated with that, is a question about whose interest do you think is served by the physical literacy discourse?
Interesting on that. Lisa's undertaking a kind of an analysis of who stakeholders are in this space, and she's reviewing kind of top 100 Google hits for physical literacy and the top 100 or plus scholarly papers, and doing an analysis of that. So we'll stay tuned, Alan. It's on its way. But yeah, I think that is a really important question to ask in whose interests and what groups are at play, and you know, what's the kind of, I guess, boundaries around each of those groups, and how are they either flowing across or how are they siloed? And it may be that, you know, there are 4 different versions of physical literacy being promoted and that none of them talk to each other, and it probably doesn't matter because we're all siloed anyway, right? Or it may be that, you know, you have this kind of flow in between these groups, and it morphs and changes and continues to evolve. But yeah, so I think that's important work that I know Lisa's currently undertaking as part of her PhD.
Great. Any other?
I would say that there are quite big moves from the more natural science or medical science field. They have really taken on the physical literacy construct or concept, and I think perhaps PT education programs has been a bit quiet, because we need to actually have a broader and more distinct discussion. How can we actually balance these different lines in terms of issues surrounding physical education, health, well-being? When we are doing health and doing well-being, then we need to balance these different stands, both philosophically but also scientifically.
All right then. Well, I noticed the time. It is 3 minutes to using up a whole hour. And so since I only saved up enough pennies to put in the meter for an hour, I'm going to have to call it to a close. And to thank, firstly, everybody who participated today. As I said, you know, we've got a huge audience there. It is absolutely thrilling to look through the Padlet, to see everybody who logged on today. I really appreciate the comments that people have added to the Padlet. The Padlet is live, so if you want to continue that discussion on the Padlet, then please do. All the panelists have got access to the Padlet, and we'll be interested to see and encourage that conversation to keep going. I also really want to thank our panelists. It was so wonderful to be able to work with each of these people, these scholars, and encourage them to write a paper for our special edition, to think critically about this concept, and then to have them participate today in our panel discussion. I really do appreciate the time and the effort and the getting up at various times to be able to do that. So thank you very much. And we'll call it a day there. Thank you.